Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary assumptions. On a bitter December evening in downtown Seattle, hundreds of people walked past what they believed was just another homeless woman huddled against the cold brick wall of a department store. Her clothes were worn, her hair unkempt, and her withered hands clutched a small metal object that most dismissed as worthless trinket. But Navy SEAL Marcus Rodriguez saw something different. In that small metal object, he recognized something that would stop him dead in his tracks and reveal a truth so powerful it would challenge everything the passers-by thought they knew about the woman they had so carelessly ignored. This is the true story of Elizabeth Chen, a woman whose past held secrets that would honor the very foundation of American military service, and how one observant veteran's recognition of a single insignia would transform not just Christmas Eve, but the lives of everyone who thought they knew what homelessness looked like. Marcus Wellington adjusted his expensive Italian suit as he stepped out of his black Tesla at the main gate of Naval Base San Diego. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt, creating waves of heat that shimmered in the distance. Marcus was not accustomed to waiting, and he certainly was not accustomed to being told no. As the founder and CEO of Wellington Technologies, a company worth over $3 billion, he expected doors to open automatically and red carpets to roll out wherever he went. Today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be his triumph. His company had just signed a massive contract with the Department of Defense to provide cutting-edge surveillance technology for naval operations. The contract was worth $200 million over 5 years, and Marcus wanted to personally oversee the installation of the first prototype systems. In his mind, this gave him the right to go anywhere on the base he pleased. He had made several calls before arriving, trying to arrange a private tour of the restricted research facilities. Each time, he was told he would need proper clearance and escort procedures. Each time, he had laughed off these requirements as bureaucratic nonsense that didn't apply to someone of his importance. After all, he reasoned, his technology would soon be protecting this very base. Surely that earned him some special privileges. The main security checkpoint was a modest concrete structure painted in standard military beige. 2 guards stood at attention, checking identification and vehicles as they passed through. Marcus barely glanced at them as he approached, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders to his assistant about scheduling conflicts and board meetings. Behind the bulletproof glass of the security station, Colonel Sarah Mitchell watched the approaching businessman with professional interest. At 42 years old, she had served in the military for over 20 years, rising through the ranks through a combination of exceptional leadership, tactical brilliance, and unwavering dedication to her country. She had commanded troops in 3 different combat zones, earned a Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire, and held a doctoral degree in Strategic Defense Studies from West Point. But, today, she was not wearing her dress uniform with its impressive array of ribbons and insignia. Today, she was conducting what the military called a ground truth assessment, working a regular security shift to better understand the daily challenges faced by the enlisted personnel under her command. She wore the standard digital camouflage uniform of a base security guard, with only her name tape and basic rank insignia visible. To Marcus Wellington, she looked like exactly what he expected to see at a military gate, another low-level functionary who would step aside once he explained his importance. Marcus ended his phone call and strode confidently to the window. He didn't wait for Sarah to speak first. "I'm Marcus Wellington, CEO of Wellington Technologies," he announced, as if the name should immediately unlock all doors. "I need access to Building 447 to inspect our equipment installations. I don't have time for the usual paperwork nonsense." Sarah looked at him with calm, professional eyes. She had dealt with hundreds of civilians who thought their importance in the outside world translated to special privileges on a military installation. Her voice was polite but firm. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wellington. I'll need to see your identification and any authorization documents for access to restricted areas. Building 447 requires special clearance that must be arranged in advance through the appropriate channels." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. He was not used to being questioned by anyone, let alone someone he perceived as a mere security guard. He pulled out his wallet and slapped his driver's license against the glass with more force than necessary. "Look, sweetheart," he said, his tone becoming condescending, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. My company just signed a $200 million contract with your bosses. That equipment in Building 447? My company designed it, my company built it, and my company is responsible for maintaining it. I have every right to inspect my own property. Sarah examined his identification carefully, then looked back at him with the same calm expression. She had faced down enemy combatants in Afghanistan who had tried to intimidate her with far more serious threats than an entitled businessman's bluster. I understand your position, Mr. Wellington, but base security protocols apply to everyone, regardless of contracts or civilian status. I can help you contact the appropriate personnel to arrange proper clearance, but I cannot grant access to restricted areas without proper authorization. Marcus's face began to redden. In his world, money talked, and when money talked, people listened. The idea that this woman in a simple uniform could stand in his way was not just frustrating, it was personally insulting. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? He demanded, his voice rising. I employ over 2,000 people. I pay more in taxes than you make in 10 years. I could buy this entire base if I wanted to. And you're going to tell me I can't walk into a building to check on my own equipment? Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. It was subtle, a slight straightening of her shoulders, a barely perceptible adjustment in how she held her head. To most people, it would have been invisible. But, to anyone with military training, it was the unmistakable bearing of someone who had commanded respect on battlefields where respect meant the difference between life and death. Mr. Wellington, she said, her voice remaining level but carrying an underlying note of steel, I understand your frustration, but my duty is to protect the security of this installation and everyone on it. That duty doesn't change based on someone's financial status or business relationships. If you'd like to proceed through proper channels, I'd be happy to help you contact base administration. Marcus laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that carried across the checkpoint. Several other personnel who were nearby turned to look at the commotion. Marcus was completely unaware that his behavior was being observed by people who knew exactly who Sarah Mitchell was and what she had accomplished in her distinguished career. This is ridiculous, Marcus declared loudly enough for everyone in the area to hear. I'm being lectured about security by some female guard who probably couldn't handle real responsibility if her life depended on it. Look at you, standing here in your little booth, checking IDs like a mall security guard. Do you really think you have the authority to tell someone like me what I can and can't do? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the checkpoint, conversations stopped. Several Navy personnel who had been going about their business paused to listen. Marcus was oblivious to the change in atmosphere, too caught up in his own indignation to notice that he had just made a serious miscalculation. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and those who knew her well would have recognized the look. It was the same expression she had worn in Iraq when facing down a local warlord who thought he could intimidate American forces through bluster and threats. It was the look of someone who had earned her position through 20 years of service to her country, who had led soldiers in combat, and who had never once backed down from doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Mr. Wellington, she said quietly, I'm going to ask you one more time to either provide proper authorization for access to restricted areas or allow me to help you contact the appropriate personnel to arrange that authorization. Those are your options. Marcus felt his control slipping away, and, like many powerful men who were used to getting their way, he responded to the loss of control with escalating aggression. He leaned closer to the window, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an intimidating whisper but was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. Listen carefully, honey. I didn't get where I am by letting some nobody in a uniform tell me what I can and can't do. You're going to open that gate, you're going to let me through, or I'm going to make some phone calls that will have you transferred to the most remote, miserable posting the military has to offer. Do you understand me? The threat was clear, and it was exactly the wrong thing to say to exactly the wrong person. But Marcus Wellington was about to learn that his assumptions about power, authority, and respect were about to be challenged in ways he never could have imagined. Because unbeknownst to him, the woman he was threatening was not just any security guard. She was someone whose true identity would soon be revealed in a way that would make this confrontation a lesson he would never forget. The commotion at the security checkpoint was beginning to draw attention from across the base entrance area. What had started as a routine interaction between a civilian contractor and security personnel was escalating into something much more significant. Marcus Wellington, still completely unaware of the true identity of the woman he was confronting, continued his verbal assault with growing confidence. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus continued, pointing an accusatory finger at Sarah through the bulletproof glass. "You people in uniform think you're special just because you wear camouflage. But, at the end of the day, you're all just government employees living off taxpayer money." "My taxpayer money? I create jobs, I drive innovation, I contribute to society. What do you do? Stand in a little box and ask for papers like some kind of border guard." Sarah Mitchell maintained her composure with the discipline that had been drilled into her through 2 decades of military service. She had faced mortar attacks in Afghanistan, had led rescue operations under enemy fire in Iraq, and had negotiated with hostile forces in situations where a single wrong word could have meant death for her and her soldiers. A wealthy businessman having a tantrum was hardly the most challenging situation she had ever handled. But what Marcus didn't realize was that his loud, public display was being witnessed by people who knew exactly who Sarah was and what she had accomplished. Word was beginning to spread through the nearby buildings that someone was causing trouble for Colonel Mitchell, and that word was reaching some very interesting ears. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison had been heading to his car when he heard the raised voices at the security checkpoint. As he got closer, he could see a well-dressed civilian gesticulating angrily at the guard station. When he realized who was on the receiving end of the man's tirade, his expression darkened considerably. Morrison had served under Sarah Mitchell's command during her deployment in Afghanistan. He had watched her lead a convoy through an ambush, personally carrying wounded soldiers to safety while under direct enemy fire. He had seen her make split-second decisions that saved dozens of lives, and he had witnessed her receive the Bronze Star for her actions that day. The idea that anyone would show her such disrespect was not something he was prepared to tolerate quietly. But Morrison was not alone in his recognition of the situation. From the administration building, Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos was also making her way toward the checkpoint. Santos had been one of Sarah's first enlisted personnel when Sarah was promoted to company command 8 years earlier. She had watched Sarah transform a demoralized unit into one of the most effective and cohesive companies in their regiment. More importantly, she had seen Sarah personally risk her career to ensure that Santos received proper medical care when she was injured during a training exercise that could have been covered up by less conscientious leadership. The word continued to spread. In the communications center, Petty Officer First Class David Kim noticed unusual activity on the security cameras monitoring the main gate. When he zoomed in and saw what was happening, he immediately picked up his phone and began making calls. Kim had been a new recruit when Colonel Mitchell had personally intervened to prevent him from washing out of a critical training program. Her mentorship had not only saved his military career but had inspired him to pursue advanced technical training that led to his current position. Within minutes, a small crowd of military personnel was beginning to gather at various points around the checkpoint, all with clear lines of sight to the confrontation. To a casual observer, they might have appeared to be going about their normal duties, but anyone with military experience would have recognized the subtle signs of a unit preparing to support their commander. Marcus, meanwhile, remained completely oblivious to the changing dynamics around him. If anything, he seemed to interpret the growing audience as validation of his position. In his mind, he was teaching an important lesson about respect and authority to someone who clearly needed to learn her place in the world. "You want to know what's really pathetic?" Marcus continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "I bet you've been doing this same job for years. Checking IDs, following your little rules, never advancing, never achieving anything meaningful. Do you know what I was doing when I was your age? Building my first company. Creating value. Making a difference in the world. And here you are, hiding behind regulations because you're too small-minded to understand that sometimes important people need exceptions made for them." Sarah's response was measured and professional, but those who knew her well could detect the slight edge in her voice that suggested her patience was being tested. "Mr. Wellington, personal attacks are not going to change base security protocols. If you'd like to continue this conversation, I'd be happy to call my supervisor to assist with your concerns. Your supervisor? Marcus laughed again, the sound carrying across the increasingly quiet area around the checkpoint. Yes, let's do that. Let's bring your supervisor down here so I can explain to them how their employee doesn't understand basic customer service. Maybe they can explain to you how the real world works. What Marcus didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell's supervisor was Brigadier General Robert Hayes, the base commander himself. General Hayes had personally recommended Sarah for her current position because he valued her operational experience and her ability to assess security procedures from a ground-level perspective. The idea of calling General Hayes down to deal with a civilian contractor's tantrum was almost amusing to those who understood the chain of command. But Sarah didn't need to make that call, because help was already on the way. From across the compound, a group of Navy SEALs was approaching the checkpoint. They had been returning from a training exercise when word reached them about the situation. These were not ordinary sailors, they were members of SEAL Team 5, one of the most elite units in the entire military. The leader of this particular group was Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, a man with 15 years of special operations experience who had served under Sarah Mitchell's command during some of the most dangerous missions of the Iraq War. Thompson had watched Sarah coordinate multiple special operations units during a complex urban warfare scenario, maintaining perfect tactical awareness while under intense pressure. He had seen her personal courage when she refused to abandon a wounded soldier even when it meant exposing herself to enemy fire. To Thompson and his fellow SEALs, Sarah Mitchell was not just another officer, she was a proven leader who had earned their respect through actions rather than rank. The fact that some civilian was publicly disrespecting her was about to become a very serious problem for that civilian. As the SEALs approached, Marcus was still lecturing Sarah about authority, respect, and proper treatment of important people. His voice had attracted attention from beyond just military personnel. Other civilian contractors and visitors to the base were beginning to take notice of the confrontation, some of them pulling out phones to record what they assumed would be an entertaining encounter between an angry businessman and military security. The problem with you military types, Marcus declared, now fully committed to his speech, is that you don't understand how the real economy works. You live in this little bubble where rank determines everything, but, out here in the real world, success is measured by results. By innovation. By creating value. I employ more people than this entire base. I generate more economic activity in a month than you probably see in a year. And, you think you can lecture me about following rules? Sarah remained silent, but her posture had shifted slightly. Those who knew her recognized the subtle change. It was the bearing of a combat veteran who was assessing a potential threat and calculating response options. Marcus interpreted her silence as submission, which only encouraged him to continue his verbal assault. You know what's really happening here, he said, his voice now carrying clearly across the entire entrance area. This is exactly what's wrong with government employees. No accountability, no understanding of efficiency, no recognition that sometimes you need to adapt your procedures to accommodate people who actually matter. You're so focused on your little rules and regulations that you can't see the bigger picture. But Marcus was wrong about the bigger picture. What he couldn't see was that he was about to become part of a much larger lesson about respect, service, and the difference between real authority and assumed privilege. The SEALs were now close enough to hear every word he was saying, and their expressions were growing darker with each insult he directed at their former commander. Senior Chief Thompson exchanged glances with his team members. They had all heard enough to understand exactly what was happening, and they had all reached the same conclusion about how this situation needed to be handled. Marcus Wellington was about to learn that his assumptions about power, respect, and military service were fundamentally flawed. The confrontation was about to enter a new phase, one that would reveal truths Marcus never could have imagined and deliver lessons he would never forget. The question was no longer whether his arrogance would be challenged, but how dramatically that challenge would unfold. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson and his team of Navy SEALs approached the security checkpoint with the silent, purposeful movement that marked them as elite warriors. Their desert camouflage uniforms were still dusty from the morning training exercise, and their equipment bore the subtle wear marks that spoke of serious operational experience. To most observers, they looked like any other military unit returning from routine duties. But Marcus Wellington, still completely absorbed in his confrontation with Sarah Mitchell, failed to notice their approach. His voice had grown even more condescending as he continued his lecture about real-world authority and proper respect for important people. "Let me explain something to you that they probably didn't teach you in your basic training," Marcus said, leaning closer to the bulletproof glass. "In the business world, we call what you're doing failure to prioritize. When someone like me shows up, someone who's actually contributing to national security through innovation and job creation, the smart move is to recognize that person's value and accommodate their needs. But you're so locked into your bureaucratic mindset that you can't see past your little rulebook." Sarah continued to maintain her professional composure, but Thompson could see the subtle signs of her growing irritation. He had worked with her long enough to recognize when her patience was being tested, and he knew that her restraint in this situation was a testament to her professionalism rather than any acceptance of the treatment she was receiving. Thompson made a subtle hand signal to his team, and they spread out in a loose formation around the checkpoint. To anyone watching, it might have appeared casual, but it was actually a tactical positioning that would allow them to control the situation completely if needed. These men had operated in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth, and they were not about to let anyone disrespect one of the finest officers they had ever served under. Marcus, still oblivious to the changing dynamics around him, pressed forward with his verbal assault. "You know what I think happened here? I think you got a little bit of authority, checking IDs, controlling a gate, and it went to your head. You started thinking you were actually important instead of recognizing that you're just a cog in a much bigger machine. A machine that people like me keep running with our taxes and our innovation." It was at this point that Senior Chief Thompson decided he had heard enough. He stepped forward, his movement deliberate and unmistakable. His voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of someone who had led men in combat and earned their absolute respect. "Excuse me, sir," Thompson said, his tone polite but with an underlying edge that suggested this was not a request. "Is there some kind of problem here?" Marcus turned to face the SEAL, and, for the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to register that he was no longer dealing with just one military person. He saw Thompson's rank insignia, noticed the special warfare pin on his uniform, and recognized that he was looking at someone with considerably more authority than a simple security guard. Finally, Marcus said, his tone brightening as if reinforcements had arrived. "Someone with some actual rank. Yes, there's definitely a problem here. Your security guard refuses to let me access facilities that my company has equipment in. I've been trying to explain to her that I have every right to inspect our installations, but she seems to think bureaucratic procedures are more important than accommodating a major defense contractor." Thompson looked at Marcus for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Sarah. What passed between them was subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with military communication. It was the look between a former subordinate and a respected commander, a moment of recognition and acknowledgement that spoke volumes about their shared history. "I see," Thompson said slowly. "And you've been explaining this to her for how long?" "Long enough to realize that she doesn't understand how important this situation is," Marcus replied, his confidence returning as he assumed he had found an ally. "Look, I get that you military people have your procedures, but sometimes common sense needs to prevail. I'm not some random civilian trying to sneak onto your base. I'm Marcus Wellington, CEO of Wellington Technologies. We just signed a $200 million contract with the Department of Defense. Surely that earns me some consideration." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. $200 million. That's certainly a significant contract. And you feel that gives you special privileges when it comes to base security? Exactly, Marcus said, pleased that someone was finally understanding his position. I mean, let's be realistic here. My company's technology is going to be protecting this base and others like it. My innovations are going to keep American servicemen and women safe. The least I should expect is professional courtesy when I need to check on our equipment installations. Professional courtesy, Thompson repeated, and there was something in his tone that should have warned Marcus that this conversation was not going in the direction he expected. That's an interesting phrase. Tell me, Mr. Wellington, what do you know about professional courtesy in the military? Marcus waved his hand dismissively. I know enough to recognize when it's not being shown. Look at her, she's been standing there like a robot, reciting regulations at me instead of recognizing that I'm someone who deserves respect. In the business world, when someone of my stature shows up, people move mountains to accommodate them. Here, I get lectured about paperwork by someone who probably makes less in a year than I spend on lunch. The insult hung in the air like a physical presence. Thompson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that made him seem suddenly more dangerous. Around the checkpoint, the other SEALs had gone completely still, their attention focused with laser intensity on the confrontation. Someone who makes less in a year than you spend on lunch, Thompson said quietly. That's an interesting way to measure a person's worth. Tell me, Mr. Wellington, what do you think determines someone's value? Their salary? Their bank account? Their ability to intimidate people they perceive as beneath them? Marcus was beginning to sense that this conversation wasn't going exactly as he had hoped, but his arrogance was too deeply ingrained for him to back down. I think a person's value is determined by their contributions to society. By their achievements. By their ability to create jobs and drive innovation. And, yes, financial success is usually a pretty good indicator of those things. Financial success, Thompson mused. That's one way to measure contribution. But, let me ask you this, how do you measure the value of someone who has dedicated their life to serving their country? Someone who has put themselves in harm's way to protect people they've never met? Someone who has earned the respect of warriors through actions rather than bank statements? The question seemed to catch Marcus off guard. Well, obviously military service is admirable, he said, though his tone suggested he considered it a lesser form of contribution. But, let's be practical here. Military service is a career choice, just like any other. People choose to serve because it offers them opportunities they couldn't get elsewhere. It's not like they're making some enormous sacrifice. The words fell like stones into a suddenly, very quiet area around the checkpoint. Thompson's team members exchanged glances that spoke of shared combat experience, of friends lost in foreign countries, of sacrifices that Marcus Wellington would never understand. The civilians who had gathered to watch the confrontation were beginning to sense that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple argument about gate procedures. Thompson took a step closer to Marcus, his movement controlled and purposeful. Career choice, he repeated. That's an interesting perspective. Tell me, Mr. Wellington, have you ever chosen to put your life on the line for someone else? Have you ever volunteered to stand between your fellow citizens and people who want to harm them? Have you ever made decisions where other people's lives depended on your judgment under the most extreme pressure imaginable? Marcus was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the direction of this conversation, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. Look, I understand that military service involves risks. But, let's not pretend it's more noble than creating jobs and driving economic growth. My company employs over 2,000 people. Those are 2,000 families who depend on the decisions I make every day. That's a pretty significant responsibility too. 2,000 employees, Thompson said. That is significant. But, let me tell you about responsibility from a different perspective. The woman you've been insulting for the past 15 minutes has been responsible for the lives of soldiers in combat zones where a single wrong decision could have meant death for dozens of people. She has led convoys through enemy territory, coordinated complex operations under fire, and personally carried wounded soldiers to safety while under direct attack. Marcus looked confused. What are you talking about? She's a security guard. She checks IDs at a gate. Thompson's smile was thin and cold. Mr. Wellington, I think it's time someone properly introduced you to the person you've been lecturing about respect and authority. He turned toward the security booth where Sarah stood, her bearing still professional despite everything she had endured. Colonel Mitchell, Thompson said, his voice carrying clearly across the checkpoint, would you mind stepping out here for a moment? I think Mr. Wellington would benefit from understanding exactly who he's been speaking to. The word colonel hit Marcus like a physical blow. His face went pale as the implications began to sink in. Around the checkpoint, military personnel who had gathered to witness the confrontation began to move closer, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed anger at how their commanding officer had been treated. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the security booth, and, suddenly, everything about her seemed different to Marcus. The quiet confidence he had dismissed as stubbornness now revealed itself as the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The steady gaze he had interpreted as defiance was clearly the look of someone who had faced far greater challenges than an angry businessman's tantrum. Thompson's voice carried across the suddenly very quiet area around the checkpoint. "Mr. Wellington, allow me to properly introduce Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Army, Bronze Star recipient, veteran of 3 combat deployments, and the finest commanding officer I've ever had the privilege to serve under." The introduction hit Marcus like a series of hammer blows. Every assumption he had made, every insult he had delivered, every condescending comment about her authority and importance suddenly took on a completely different meaning. He was looking at someone whose achievements and service record made his business success seem trivial by comparison. But Thompson wasn't finished. Colonel Mitchell is currently conducting ground truth assessments of base security procedures as part of her duties as Deputy Installation Security Chief. What you've been interpreting as some low-level security guard following bureaucratic rules was actually one of the most experienced and decorated officers on this base doing her job exactly as it should be done. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in years, possibly decades, he was completely speechless. The woman he had spent 15 minutes insulting and belittling was not only his superior in every meaningful way, but someone whose service to their country made his own contribution seem insignificant. And this was only the beginning of the lesson he was about to receive. The silence that followed Senior Chief Thompson's introduction was deafening. Marcus Wellington stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as the full weight of his mistake began to settle over him like a suffocating blanket. Every word he had spoken, every insult he had delivered, every condescending comment about authority and respect was now reframing itself in his mind with devastating clarity. Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood quietly, her posture unchanged, but now Marcus could see what everyone else had seen from the beginning. This was not someone pretending to authority. This was someone who had earned it through sacrifice, courage, and years of service that Marcus was only beginning to comprehend. Thompson was not finished with his introduction. His voice remained calm and professional, but there was steel beneath his words that made it clear he was delivering more than just information, he was issuing a correction to a fundamental misunderstanding. "Perhaps Mr. Wellington would be interested in learning more about the woman he's been lecturing about real-world authority," Thompson continued. Colonel Mitchell earned her Bronze Star during Operation Enduring Freedom when her convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. While under direct enemy fire, she coordinated the evacuation of wounded soldiers, personally carried 3 men to safety, and held a defensive position for over 2 hours until reinforcements arrived. Marcus felt his legs growing weak. He looked at Sarah with new eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet woman in the standard uniform with the image of a combat leader carrying wounded soldiers under enemy fire. "But that was just one day," Thompson went on, his words measured and deliberate. "Colonel Mitchell has served 3 combat deployments spanning 8 years. She has led company-level operations in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan and Iraq. She holds a master's degree in strategic studies from the War College and a doctoral degree in international security from Georgetown University. She speaks 4 languages fluently and has served as a diplomatic liaison in situations where a single wrong word could have meant the difference between peace and armed conflict." Each fact hit Marcus like a physical blow. His earlier comments about her educational limitations and lack of achievements were now revealing themselves as not just wrong, but grotesquely ignorant. He had assumed that her position at a security checkpoint meant she was limited in her capabilities and aspirations, when in reality he was looking at someone whose qualifications and experiences far exceeded his own in nearly every meaningful category. "The ground truth assessment Colonel Mitchell is conducting," Thompson continued, "was requested by the base commander specifically because of her operational experience and her proven ability to identify security vulnerabilities that others might miss. Her recommendations have already led to security improvements at 3 other installations, potentially preventing incidents that could have cost lives and compromised national security." Marcus tried to find words, but every possible response seemed inadequate. How do you apologize for 15 minutes of sustained insults directed at someone whose service record revealed your own accomplishments to be relatively trivial? How do you explain away comments about authority and respect when speaking to someone who had literally bled for her country? But Thompson still wasn't finished. He had served under Sarah Mitchell's command during some of the most challenging operations of his career, and he wanted to ensure that Marcus understood exactly what kind of person he had been insulting. During her deployment in Iraq, Thompson said, Colonel Mitchell was responsible for coordinating joint operations between Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine units. She managed logistics for operations involving over 5,000 personnel while maintaining operational security in an environment where intelligence leaks could have been fatal. Her leadership during the siege of Forward Operating Base Delta was credited with preventing what intelligence estimates suggested could have been one of the deadliest attacks on American forces during that conflict. Marcus's face had gone from pale to ashen gray. He was beginning to understand that his encounter with what he had assumed was a simple security guard was actually an encounter with military royalty, someone whose achievements and service record represented the very best of American military leadership. The Bronze Star Colonel Mitchell received, Thompson continued, was awarded not just for her actions during that single ambush, but for her sustained superior performance under combat conditions. The citation reads, in part, that her exceptional courage, tactical brilliance, and unwavering commitment to her soldiers exemplified the highest traditions of military service and reflected great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. Around the checkpoint, more military personnel had gathered. Word had spread through the base that someone was receiving a very public education about respect and military service, and people were coming to witness what had become an epic correction of civilian arrogance. Among the growing crowd were soldiers who had served under Sarah's command, officers who had worked alongside her, and support personnel who had benefited from her leadership. Petty Officer First Class David Kim stepped forward from the crowd. His voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. Colonel Mitchell saved my military career when I was about to wash out of advanced technical training. She didn't have to intervene, and it would have been easier for her to let me fail. But she took the time to identify why I was struggling and arranged for additional support that not only helped me graduate but inspired me to pursue leadership positions I never thought I could handle. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos followed. During my injury recovery, Colonel Mitchell personally ensured I received the best possible medical care. She fought through military bureaucracy and challenged decisions by officers who outranked her to make sure I got treatment that doctors said was critical to my full recovery. She risked her own career advancement to take care of a junior enlisted person she barely knew. One by one, other personnel began sharing their own experiences with Sarah Mitchell's leadership. Marcus found himself listening to a litany of examples that painted a picture of an officer whose concern for her people extended far beyond what was required by duty or regulation. These were stories of personal sacrifice, moral courage, and the kind of leadership that earned genuine loyalty rather than demanded superficial respect. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stepped forward last. Mr. Wellington, you mentioned earlier that you employ 2,000 people and that this gives you authority and demonstrates your value to society. Colonel Mitchell has been responsible for the lives of thousands of soldiers across multiple deployments. But, more than that, she has trained and mentored hundreds of officers who have gone on to leadership positions throughout the military. Her influence on military leadership extends far beyond her direct command, and will continue to protect American interests for decades to come. The contrast was devastating. Marcus had spent years defining himself by his wealth, his business success, and his ability to control others through financial leverage. But he was now facing someone whose contributions to society were measured in lives saved, soldiers trained, and threats neutralized. Her authority came not from her ability to intimidate or by influence, but from a proven record of sacrifice and service that had been tested in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Sarah Mitchell had remained silent throughout this recitation of her achievements and service record. Now she stepped forward, and, when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority that Marcus had dismissed as bureaucratic stubbornness. Mr. Wellington, she said, I want to be clear that my service record doesn't change base security protocols. You still need proper authorization to access restricted areas, regardless of your contract status or business relationships. However, I also want you to understand that the people you've been insulting, not just me, but military personnel in general, have dedicated their lives to protecting the freedoms that allow you to build your business and achieve your success. Her words were measured and professional, but they carried an undeniable weight. This was not someone making excuses or trying to justify her position. This was someone who had earned the right to speak with authority about service, sacrifice, and the protection of American interests. The security procedures you've been dismissing as bureaucratic nonsense, Sarah continued, exist because people like me have seen what happens when security fails. Every regulation you consider an inconvenience was written in someone's blood, written because we learned, often through tragic experience, what happens when we prioritize convenience over security. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I had no idea. I'm sorry. I assumed. You assumed that military service was less valuable than business success, Thompson interjected. You assumed that someone in a security uniform couldn't possibly have achieved anything significant. You assumed that your wealth gave you the right to treat other people with contempt. The words hit Marcus like physical blows because they were absolutely accurate. Every assumption he had made was being laid bare, and each one revealed not just ignorance, but a fundamental failure to understand the value of service over self-interest. Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen combat, had watched soldiers die for their country, and had made life-and-death decisions in environments where failure meant real consequences for real people. Mr. Wellington, I hope this experience will help you understand that authority and respect cannot be bought or demanded. They must be earned through actions, through service, and through the willingness to put something larger than yourself above your personal interests. But even this powerful lesson was not the end of Marcus Wellington's education. The most devastating revelation was yet to come, and it would involve connections between his business and the military that he never could have anticipated. Marcus Wellington stood in the midst of what had become a circle of military personnel, each face reflecting varying degrees of disapproval at his behavior. The weight of his mistakes was crushing, but he was about to learn that his education was far from complete. Senior Chief Thompson exchanged a meaningful look with Colonel Mitchell, and she gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Mr. Wellington, Thompson said, there's something else you should know about your relationship with Colonel Mitchell. Something that I think will put your entire interaction today into an even clearer perspective. Marcus looked confused and increasingly desperate. I don't understand. I've already apologized. I realize I made terrible assumptions and said inexcusable things. What else could there be? Thompson's expression was grim. Tell me, Mr. Wellington, when your company was developing the surveillance technology for the Defense Department contract, who do you think reviewed the security specifications? Who evaluated whether your systems would actually protect American installations and personnel? Who signed off on the recommendation that your technology was suitable for military use? Marcus felt a cold dread beginning to form in his stomach. The Defense Department has review committees. Technical specialists. Security experts. Yes, Thompson agreed. And the lead security consultant for your project, the person who spent months evaluating your technology and ultimately recommended approval of your contract, was Colonel Sarah Mitchell. The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. He stared at Sarah in complete shock, his mind racing to process the implications. The woman he had spent 15 minutes insulting, the person he had dismissed as a low-level security guard who didn't understand his importance, was the very person responsible for his company's biggest contract success. Sarah spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of professional authority that Marcus was finally beginning to recognize. Your surveillance systems show promise, Mr. Wellington, but they also have vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile forces. My recommendation for contract approval was contingent on addressing those security concerns through a series of modifications and additional safeguards. Marcus felt the world shifting beneath his feet. You were the security consultant? The reports I received, the technical recommendations, the security modifications, those all came from you? The reports came from my team, Sarah clarified, but I personally reviewed every specification, every vulnerability assessment, and every recommendation for improvement. Your technology's effectiveness in protecting American military installations was my responsibility to evaluate. Thompson continued the revelation. Colonel Mitchell's security assessments saved the Department of Defense from deploying technology that could have been compromised by enemy forces. Her recommendations prevented what could have been a catastrophic intelligence failure. Your contract was approved not despite military bureaucracy, but because of the thorough, professional evaluation conducted by someone who actually understands the life and death implications of security technology. Marcus was struggling to breathe. Every assumption he had made was not just wrong, it was the complete opposite of reality. He had insulted the person who had made his success possible, who had ensured his technology was actually capable of protecting the installations he claimed to care about. But there's more, Thompson said, and Marcus wondered how much worse this could possibly get. Colonel Mitchell's security evaluation identified several critical vulnerabilities in your original design. Rather than simply rejecting the contract, she worked with your technical team to develop solutions. She provided consultation that improved your technology's effectiveness by an estimated 40%. Sarah nodded. Your lead engineer, Dr. Patricia Chen, worked directly with my team for 3 months to implement security improvements. Many of the innovations that make your surveillance system superior to competing technologies were developed through that collaboration. Dr. Chen specifically credited our security recommendations with transforming what would have been a standard surveillance package into something genuinely revolutionary. Marcus remembered those consultations, but he had never bothered to learn the details about who was providing the expertise. He had assumed it was just more military bureaucracy, technical specialists doing routine evaluations. He had never imagined that the insights improving his technology were coming from a combat veteran with advanced degrees and real-world experience in security operations. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stepped forward again. Mr. Wellington, Colonel Mitchell didn't just approve your contract, she made it successful. The security improvements she recommended are now being implemented in surveillance systems across multiple defense contractors. Your technology has become the standard not because of your business acumen, but because of her expertise. The revelation was devastating. Marcus had built his identity around being a self-made success, someone who had achieved greatness through his own vision and capabilities. But he was learning that his greatest achievement had been possible only because of the expertise and dedication of the very person he had spent the afternoon insulting. Sarah looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. Mr. Wellington, when you demanded access to Building 447 to inspect your equipment, you were asking to see installations that exist in their current form because of security recommendations I provided. The systems you wanted to check were deployed using protocols my team developed. Even your inspection procedures would need to follow security guidelines that I helped establish. Marcus felt completely hollow. Every point of pride he had expressed, every achievement he had used to justify his arrogance, was connected to the work and expertise of the woman he had dismissed as insignificant. I don't understand, Marcus said weakly. If you were the security consultant, if you were responsible for approving my contract, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you identify yourself? Sarah's response was measured and professional. Because my job today was to evaluate base security procedures from a ground-level perspective. Personal recognition was irrelevant to that mission. And, because proper security protocols don't change based on personal relationships or past professional connections. You still needed proper authorization for access to restricted areas. Thompson added, and, because Colonel Mitchell is a professional who doesn't use her position or achievements to intimidate civilians, even when those civilians are treating her with complete disrespect. The contrast was crushing. While Marcus had spent the entire afternoon trying to use his wealth and position to intimidate and override security procedures, Sarah had quietly done her job according to proper protocols despite having every right to pull rank and demonstrate her authority. Chief Santos spoke up from the gathered crowd. Mr. Wellington, you mentioned that military people don't understand the real economy or how to create value. Colonel Mitchell's security recommendations have been implemented across the defense industry. The protocols she helped develop are now protecting installations worth billions of dollars and housing technology that represents decades of research and development. Her work has directly contributed to the security of America's most critical defense assets. Dr. Kim added, the training programs Colonel Mitchell developed for security personnel are being used at installations across the country. She has personally trained over 200 security specialists who are now protecting everything from nuclear facilities to classified research installations. Her influence on American defense security extends far beyond her direct command. Marcus was learning that he had not just insulted a distinguished officer, but someone whose work had shaped modern military security practices. Her contributions to national defense were measured not just in individual acts of heroism, but in systemic improvements that would protect American interests for decades to come. Sarah looked at Marcus directly. Mr. Wellington, I want you to understand something important. The security procedures you were so eager to bypass, the regulations you dismissed as bureaucratic nonsense, the protocols you wanted me to ignore, these exist because people like me have seen what happens when security fails. Every rule you considered an inconvenience was written because we learned, often through terrible experience, what happens when we prioritize convenience over security. Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen combat, who had witnessed the consequences of security failures, and who understood that the regulations Marcus dismissed as bureaucracy were actually lessons learned in blood. Your surveillance technology is excellent, Sarah continued, but it's only as effective as the security protocols surrounding its use. The access procedures you wanted to bypass are designed to ensure that your technology remains secure and effective. Violating those protocols doesn't demonstrate importance, it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how security actually works. Thompson stepped closer to Marcus. Mr. Wellington, you spent this afternoon lecturing Colonel Mitchell about authority, respect, and real-world value. But you've learned that she has more authority than you understood, has earned more respect than you recognized, and has created more real-world value than you realized. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. These were not people who could be intimidated by wealth or impressed by business success. These were professionals who had dedicated their lives to something larger than personal achievement, who had earned their positions through service and sacrifice. I need to completely rethink everything I thought I knew, Marcus said finally. About authority. About respect. About what really makes someone valuable to society. Colonel Mitchell, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond words. My behavior was inexcusable, and my assumptions were not just wrong, they were an insult to everything you've accomplished and sacrificed. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his apology, but her expression remained professional. Mr. Wellington, I hope this experience will help you understand that the people who serve our country, whether they're checking IDs at a gate or leading combat operations, deserve respect not because of their rank or recognition, but because of their commitment to something larger than themselves. Marcus left Naval Base San Diego that afternoon with his entire worldview fundamentally altered. He had arrived assuming his wealth and business success granted him special privileges and justified his treatment of others as inferior. He left understanding that true authority comes from service, that real respect must be earned through sacrifice, and that the greatest achievements are often those that benefit others rather than oneself. The encounter would change not just how he treated military personnel, but how he understood leadership, responsibility, and the difference between having power and earning respect. And he would never again assume he understood someone's worth based on their uniform, their position, or their willingness to follow proper procedures. Colonel Sarah Mitchell returned to her security assessment, having demonstrated once again why she was considered one of the finest officers in the military. She had maintained her professionalism even under sustained verbal attack, had done her job according to proper protocols regardless of personal considerations, and had ultimately provided a lesson that would benefit not just Marcus Wellington, but everyone who witnessed the encounter. The incident became a story told throughout the military community, not as a tale of revenge or humiliation, but as an example of how quiet professionalism and earned authority ultimately command more respect than wealth, bluster, or assumed privilege ever could.